How you doing, man?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Good. It's good to see you. It's
Yeah,
been a while.
it has been a while. It's been a while. You've been busy too, haven't you?
I
I've been
know.
seeing
Yeah.
social media. You've been building some amazing things.
Oh, yeah. Did you see my last post? I went kind of crazy yesterday.
I did.
I'm like, man, I never post. And then I just got in a posting frenzy. I still got some more stuff I might post today. It's crazy. Actually, most of that stuff was done a while ago. So
Yeah.
I'm just bad about social media.
You know what? I am too. I don't think that we have lived with social media long enough to evolve to figure out how to live with it entirely.
Yeah. Some people do a pretty
Right?
good job with it, though. Man.
I don't know if I trust people who do a really good job with social media though,
You
because
should have
I
burned a
think
lot of bridges on that one.
you've got people people like you've got the other things to do than be on social media, right?
Yeah, it seems that way.
Yeah, or
It's
you
just hard
should.
to think about. Yesterday, I was scraping a painting down. So it's a 10-foot painting.
Yeah,
You need to come to the studio, by the way. I
yeah.
want your, how do I put this? Your expertise, your good taste. I need some input and see how I'm doing on this painting. But
You want me to come in and to treat it like a Bravo reality show where I just rip into shreds and we get into a big argument and we'll film the whole thing,
perfect.
right?
Perfect.
Perfect.
But then we'll turn the cameras off and you can just tell me how awesome it is after
Okay.
that. Yeah. Uh, but I was scraping the painting with a big wood scraper. Do you know what a wood scraper is?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And so for those who don't know, it's basically just a piece of sheet metal that's hardened, of carbon steel. And the edge is burnished. So it has this little, the edge curls over just a little and creates this like microscopic blade. And I use that instead of sandpaper. I'm scraping the entire top half of the painting because it's all in shadow and I want it smooth. I've got a pile of paint, like dried paint shavings on the floor that is frankly kind of huge. And because the painting's so big. And one of my students is like, oh, you should have filmed this whole thing. It's really interesting. I'm like, dude, that's the last thing I'm thinking about when I'm working.
Yeah.
Ooh, grab the camera and watch. So people can watch me scrape a painting. I'm like, oh, I can't be bothered. I should be better about it.
What you should do now is you should take those scraps. You should break them into pieces, put them in resin, and sell necklaces and jewelry.
That's brilliant.
That's a really good use of your time, and it'll be
brilliant.
Pieces of Jeff. You can own a piece of Jeff HEIN's work. It's the new NFT.
Dude, it's more legitimate than an NFT. I'd argue.
I agree.
At least there's something there.
Yeah, let's do an entire podcast one day on how we both hate NFTs.
Is it?
Do
you know anything?
How we turning art into something that isn't actually appreciated as art or valuable at the same time.
Do you know where that's gone? I mean, I still get emails all the time, not emails, but messages on Instagram, people wanting NFTs, and I assume it's a scam. Yeah. But do they still have value? I thought the whole thing crashed.
Yeah, I think it pretty much crashed. I think there are maybe a handful of artworks that, because they were sold at auction, purchased, and donated to a museum as a kind of like artifact of the era.
Yeah.
Those are worth something.
So that dude the guy who made like $30 million right up front.
Yeah.
His work, maybe.
I think his work, maybe, because I think that it's almost like, what's a good example? I mean, like, there's so many pieces of technology that have gone the way of the dinosaurs, right? That we're not interested in anymore.
Right.
But we're interested in having an example of that relic.
Right.
No one's trading in NFTs that I know of really anymore.
Yeah. Didn't some Utah artist kind of tinker around with that a little bit too?
I don't know.
I feel like Brian Taylor did a couple NFT things.
Brian Taylor did. You're right. And I do know there were some people that approached me and turned works we had in the gallery that were by famous artists into NFTs.
Really?
Yeah, and I don't know or really care what happened to them.
It's so weird. Did you
Yeah.
see the latest auction, the Sotheby's auction, where they sold that banana to some Chinese
Oh,
investor who
jeez.
then ate it?
Yeah, jeez.
So weird.
You know, there was this
I do not
so
understand it.
I can't remember the name. It'll come to me. One of the listeners will have it off the top of their head, but there was I vaguely remember my undergraduate was in business economics and
Yeah.
marketing, and then I did my art history later. And we read the essay. I can't remember who it was. Veblen? He's the one who coined the terms pecuniary emulation and conspicuous consumption. And
Hmm.
he used pecuniary emulation is really simply explained. It's the idea of keeping up with the Smiths, is the term we use in the United States. It's that your neighbor gets a new car, and then within so many months or years, everyone else is getting a new car. They upgrade their garage, they change the color, they do this.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody, that's called pecuniary emulation, right? So it's monetary emulation. Then
Yeah.
he used the example of these tribes in the Pacific Northwest, these Native American tribes, that every year, within the sight of one another, these rival tribes would burn as much of their wealth as they could in front of the other tribe in order to show how wealthy they were.
Really?
And it was isn't or we are so wealthy, the
That's
message
boss.
was, that
Like,
we can destroy all of this stuff that's so desirable
yeah.
in order to show how wealthy we are. And that was called conspicuous or visible consumption. Conspicuous consumption.
Hmm.
And that banana, like, the purpose of buying and eating that banana was for that tech guy to get the marketing to show that he had so much wealth that he could do that and it wouldn't hurt him or really be a meaningful loss in any way. And he's
Oh, do you
probably,
really think that's it?
and I think he probably got $30 million worth of advertising for who he is, for his projects as a result of it, because now people actually there's name recognition at a time when it's really hard to get name recognition for projects. But the cost that he had to calculate with that is how many people think, yeah, I mean, he got a name for being an idiot, right?
Yeah, from the layperson, but maybe his people, his circle thinks he's a hotshot because he can just throw money away. Is
I think
that what you're
that's
saying?
the calculation is conspicuous consumption, is that I have so much money I can do whatever I want with it. It's the equivalent of a music artist who goes to the club and is showering people in Dom Perignon, right? I mean, it's like
But
I've got
can't you
so
do the
much
same
money.
thing by just walking down the middle of a street full of homeless people and throwing cash around?
Yeah. I mean, to me, and you, right? To both of us, it's a saner, and I mean, albeit they're both egotistical ends,
Right, but at least
right?
one
But at
is
least
you're
one
actually doing
is
something.
in the service of something.
Yeah.
A funny wrinkle on this story is, did you hear that the guy who sold the banana for 25 cents complained that he didn't get any money in the process, and some people created
Wait. Hold on a sec. Is the you talking about the artist?
no, I'm talking
Who
about
sold the
the
banana?
guy who owned the fruit stand
Oh my
from which the
gosh.
banana was purchased. He complained that he didn't get anything as part of the process, and people did a what do you call it when you raise money online for people?
I have no idea.
Those it's like that thing where you can, like, it's a charitable site where you can raise money
Oh,
for people. You know what I'm
oh man,
talking
I'm
about?
drawing a blank. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, whatever it
I'm
is.
drawing a
Through
blank
that
though.
service, they raised $20,000 for him because
For the banana.
yeah, like people crowdfunded $20,000 in charity for the fruit stand owner so that he didn't feel like he was left out of the $30 million sale.
We live in such a strange world.
I know,
It's
right?
so crazy.
I know.
I can't believe he had the nerve to complain about it.
I know. I know, right? Next thing you know, the people who like have the duct tape and who painted the wall are going to be like,
Yeah,
hold
seriously.
on a
What about
second.
us?
Like I created that duct tape. That duct.
Gosh, man. Yeah, but what do you think about Sotheby's part in the whole thing? So that explains the investor, but what about Sotheby's? Do you think that Sotheby's actually buys into this whole thing, or do you think they just
Oh, I think that it's all. I think they Sotheby's and Christie's, more Sotheby's than Christie's. And I say it breaks my heart to say this because I did my master's at Sotheby's.
mm-hmm.
And Sotheby's and Christie's were founded within a few years of one another in the 18th century. And the old joke was that in London, that Christie's was founded by business people who wanted to be nobility, and Sotheby's was founded by noblemen who wanted to be business people.
Really?
And so, like many of the people who I worked for who did uh Sotheby who were at Sotheby's or who I just spent my time with, they had legitimate noble titles that were passed down generationally, and they had worked in uh in the auction world. I mean, they could trace back hundreds of years their work, and they were real connoisseurs. But Sotheby's had been taken over as a as a quarterly profit Wall Street institution sometime in the early 2000s, and people I knew who had been there previous to that time felt like Sotheby's had sold its soul. And Christie's did at the same time. But Christie's got bought back as a private company in the teens, in like 2010, 2013, something like that. And so Christie's kind of regained its soul and was interested. I mean, you could argue that neither one of them really cares about anything but the bottom line.
Right.
But I think Sotheby's is the worse of the two when it comes to just selling stuff. I mean, they also they probably got addicted to the drug through they did a Damien Hirst show that went viral, and they're the ones, the Sotheby's auction house is the one that remember the Banksy that shredded itself partially?
Mm-hmm.
That happened at Sotheby's. So I'm sure that Sotheby's was all for like, let's sell a banana that somebody eats. Let's do it, you know?
But what I want to know is if behind the scenes they're all laughing and saying to one another, we just totally pulled the wool over all these people's eyes again and now are skipping to the bank. Or if they actually believe that this banana has value, obviously has 25 cents worth of value, but has $30 million of value or whatever it was that got auctioned off for.
So here's Micah's like pop psychology take on it.
Okay.
My pop psychology take is that the art world and the art market have long passed the point where they consider quality as a primary factor of what they sell.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't even come into consideration. And so they don't feel like they're pulling the wool over somebody's eyes. They feel like they are doing something that is culturally relevant.
Really?
So the way that they think of things is, this isn't good or bad art. This isn't well done or not well done. This wasn't a waste of our intellectual power, energy, or marketing. For whatever reason, it captured international attention, and that was the goal. And that is and that attention is a measure of relevance, right? And so it's whether or not this work is culturally relevant at the moment.
So if a thing captures the world's attention because it's completely ridiculous and idiotic, because let's face it, that's the only reason the world is paying attention.
Yeah.
To them, that's still culturally relevant?
I think that I do not think that they are in the business of yeah, I had a friend who he's a pretty he's pretty high up in the journalistic world.
Yeah.
And his real love is novels. He wants to write a novel. And I asked him, you know, why can't you just be satisfied with journalism? And he said, well, because he said we say in our world, in the journalistic world, that journalism is the first draft of history. And they use words like for the New York Times, which I think is true, that the New York Times is the journal of record because they've got so many correspondents paid around the world. They capture the information. They have fact checkers that make everything that they say is accurate on the level of it's not second or third hand, right? It's first hand. It's been said. Now we can argue about about whether or not what they say is skewed by a particular perspective or not. That's not what I'm talking about. But he said the problem is that everything I write in journalism is forgotten within a month, a year, 2 years. No one cares about it anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
He
Or even
said
a
so it's
day, really,
yeah,
anymore.
he said it's just gone. So he said we can tell ourselves that it's it's the record, it's the journal of record, or it's the first draft of history. And people may come back and look through the archives, which I do as an historian. I look all the time at newspapers, right? And I don't read through the whole newspaper. I'm just interested in like the one thing I'm searching for. So newspapers have their point, right? But I just finished reading F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, for the first time in decades, right? And there's a novel that outlasted, it was unbelievable, Jeff. Unbelievable, right?
Hmm.
And the difference between me reading it as in my in my late teens versus now is huge. And it's considered by many to be the greatest novel of all time, right?
Hmm.
F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote a lot of articles for magazines. They're totally forgettable, right? I'm sure they were done at the same level of quality in some ways as his novels were. But I think of art in the same way. Sotheby's is in the business of like, when you're thinking about cultural relevance and capturing the attention of people, it has nothing to do with the longevity of its actual cultural impact over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's Sotheby's, when they do a show like this, they get $30 million. Like $30 million is what it's sold for. Sotheby's probably gets 30% of that, right? 20 to 30% of that.
Just as the
And
middleman.
yeah, just as the middleman. And they made a lot of money. The seller made a lot of money. The artist made money. The tech guy got attention, and no one will care about it ever again. And then you look at something like I mean, it's trite. We use it all the time as an example, but like Van Gogh, who sold one work during his lifetime, or Frida Kahlo, whose husband was making lots of money and she didn't really have any esteem during her lifetime, but they're things that took a while to gain momentum and steam and and to have cultural relevance, right? The
Hmm.
banana Sotheby's is not in the business of actually being a caretaker over the long term of anything being meaningful.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Like they're
Yeah.
just they're just short, and so connoisseurship has very little to do with it. It's like they are filling a funnel full of whatever they think is relevant, and then very few things come out of that, and even fewer things last.
Did you know that I interviewed Odd Nerdrum?
Oh, did you really?
Yeah, I haven't
That's
posted it yet.
someone.
That's a
That's someone I can't wait to hear
Yeah,
about.
I haven't posted it yet because it's kind of a hard edit. It's just because of his camera situation and audio situation. So I had to do extra work to edit this thing. So I haven't posted it yet. But he refuses to call himself an artist because of what art has been defined as today. I hope I'm not misquoting him, but or misinterpreting his perspective. But from what I got from him is like, no, I'm not an artist. I can't remember what he says. He's a creator of kitsch. I can't remember if he has he might have had another term for what he actually is, but now I
That's
can't remember.
interesting. I'm always open
Yeah.
to whatever people's definitions are of words, but I heard a really interesting definition of kitsch versus camp.
I don't
And,
even know
and
what camp is. What is
so
camp?
so like the airplane movies or Naked Gun movies, they're camp. Or the like the movies by Mel Brooks of Young Frankenstein and History of the World, and they're camp because they're self-aware. They know they're silly,
Oh, okay.
right? And so if
And
something's
kitsch would be
campy,
like a Hallmark movie or something.
and kitsch is something that is bad, that is bad but doesn't know it's bad. So
Yeah.
camp is like deliberately corny, self-aware, silly,
Right, right.
um, and self-referential in a way that. But kitsch doesn't know it's bad, and I,
Well,
but
he's redefining it.
and there are
Yeah.
more definitions. There are other people who have much deeper definitions of kitsch. That was a shorthand that I heard, and I've heard people, and it was a huge insult in the when kitsch first came out because it's a German term, and I think it was originally used by Bauhaus. I want to say there was an insult to say your art is kitsch. It's bad, right?
Oh, I know
Because
that's what most people think, but he owns it. He's like,
interesting.
he says to call it art is bad. Again, I'm anxious for everyone to hear the podcast and interpret it and see how people interpret the conversation.
Can't wait
But
to hear
what
it.
I got out of it was he's like, art is bad because art is all about expressing your feelings, where kitsch is craftsmanship. It's the higher pursuit, of excellence. And
Oh,
it
interesting.
is interesting. He's just rejected the art world because, I would argue, because of these things like the bananas and duct tape and various other things. He's just like, no,
Okay, so
like I'm not
here
an artist. I don't want to be part of that. So, and
me,
I kind of
me
wish there were two terms. I mean, he's made two terms, but I wish the world had two terms for artists. The modern artist that's all about concept and only concept, versus the artist who also strives for good craftsmanship. I wish there was a distinction between the two, but
yeah,
yeah.
I know that Arnold Freeberg and some of the people who were part of his generation, like Tom Lovell, um, they wouldn't use the word artist. They called themselves illustrators because they believed that in their time, when abstraction and pop art had become such dominant terms,
Mm-hmm.
um, they felt like there was a huge split in the art world at the turn of the century, where there were those who were creating philosophical artwork that was personal and had no ethic of craft. And then there was illustration, which had a real ethic of craft that was the foundation of its definition. That's how he saw it. And so when you talked with Arnold Freeberg, he'd say, I'm not an artist. I'm an illustrator."
Hmm.
And most people would have considered that a demotion. I'm so interested to hear the Odd Nedrum interview because I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people who are are arguably from the modern art critique perspective, who come from that modernist tradition, who admire his work because of his very obvious use of sexuality in his work, and they
Right.
don't care at all about the craft. And then you talk with a lot of artists who are very interested in the craft, who see his use of sexuality as a distraction from his craft. And so he, to be one who says, I'm not interested in this gimmicky art world, and then for him to be someone who has been perceived as arguably using um um you know sex as a way to as a central theme of his work, and sex, no matter how you use it, can be controversial. So
Mm-hmm.
it'll be interesting to see in your interview. Do you guys talk about it?
Not that directly. No, we
Interesting.
didn't. In fact, I didn't pull up a lot of that kind of work because, I want to keep my audience as broad as possible.
Yeah.
Some of that
And
work
it's
is
that's a
pretty heavy.
it's a fair point because not all of his work is that, but it's
No,
what a
no, it's
lot of
not.
people remember.
In fact, I would argue I would say it's very insignificant part of his work. I mean, not insignificant, a very small part of what
You
his
mean just
overall
like
portfolio.
as a portion of his
Yeah, an
portfolio
insignificant portion. That's what I mean. Yeah,
interesting.
it's like if he does 100 paintings, it might be 3 of them that are that way. I think
Interesting.
most of them, from what I can tell, I mean, looking through his portfolio before I interviewed him, I was actually surprised on how difficult it was to find that stuff. There was a lot more apocalyptic type stuff than sexually
Interesting.
explicit stuff. So,
Interesting.
but I think he's genuinely sincere in what he does, and I think sometimes that's just the key. Is he trying to just get a rise out of people, or is he just painting what he's interested in,
Right.
whatever that means, But it was great talk. He seems like a really cool guy, nice guy.
I can't wait to
Um,
hear it.
yeah,
Can't wait to hear it.
I know. I got to get it up. It's been like a month since I talked to him. But that whole illustration thing, it's funny. I had someone call me an illustrator 10 years ago
Mhm.
through someone
Were
else.
you
It was
insulted?
unbelievably insulted. I was freaking angry. But you know what? Now I wouldn't care.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wouldn't care. I'm kind of leaning toward his camp, Nerdrum's camp in a way. Again, I have to say, if on the small chance Odd Nerdrum hears this, I apologize if I misinterpreted anything he said, but I think I understood it correctly. But that said, what I took from it was, you know what? The world's definition of an artist doesn't fit me the way I
Hmm.
wanted it to as a young painter. And so I'm okay with being an illustrator. I mean, I am an illustrator. I'm right now. All I'm doing is illustrating the Bible. So whatever. If you want to call me an artist, call me an artist. If you want to call me an illustrator, call me an illustrator. I don't care.
Okay,
You
so
know.
this could be a completely different topic, arguably for a podcast than the one we're going for. But I have my own interpretation, which I have not checked with anybody else on the difference between fine art and illustration.
Okay. What is it?
Okay, so let me first give you an example. So, um, let's say you're looking at a work by Banksy,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking in particular of the work of a guy who he's leaning back and he's holding, instead of a Molotov cocktail, he's holding a bunch of flowers that
I
he's
vaguely
throwing,
remember that. Yeah.
right? And the idea is that instead of this, he's cleverly exchanged the violence of the Molotov cocktail while the guy's still in a violent motion with flowers. And so
Yeah.
it's the contrast of violent action with non-violent thing, right? And when you look at it, you get it after that fast, right? Like it
Right.
just takes 3 seconds to get it. You don't sit and stare at it for long. And the longer you stare at it, you don't get any more out of it, right?
Right.
And you don't necessarily think on it over and over and over again, right? And to me, the difference between fine art and non-fine art is the ability to take a subject, familiar or unfamiliar, and to make you think on deeper levels. It stimulates, it can sustain deeper conversation and thought over a sustained period of time, right? It doesn't matter what the subject is. I've got a painting of a young woman who is watching a baby in a dark room who's just knitting.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, I walk by that in my house every day, and I just am transfixed, and it makes me think thoughts that I never thought I'd think before. It ramps up my contemplation, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the difference between fine art and non-fine art. Okay, that's one distinction.
Okay, can
An
we stop? Can I
illustration,
throw in something real quick before you
yeah.
don't lose this thought because I want to hear the second half. But I am embarrassed to admit that I've done something in the past, and I'm going to tell you what it is and tell tell the whole world what it is. But there have been times where I'm in a show or I have a show and I show up incognito, you know, just like, in other words, it's not like I'm a movie star, so no one would know who I was anyway. But the point is, I'm not advertising that I'm the artist. I'm just sort of like sneaking around.
The moment you take off your hat, I don't recognize you anyway.
This episode is brought to you in part by Rosemary Brushes. If you're one of my listeners who's a professional artist, you're already using Rosemary Brushes. But for the rest of you, come on. Take your work a little more seriously. Stop buying the other brands. It's just not worth it. Every now and then you may get lucky and buy a good brush from another brand, but use the brand that professionals like myself are using. Go to rosemaryandco.com, link in the description or the show notes, and get yourself some quality brushes before your next painting.
I know, it's ridiculous. It's just an egg with a goatee. But anyway, so there was this one time I was at the Springville Museum of Art, and it was so fascinating because I had that big Christ painting with the chickens in it.
Yeah.
Which was, I think it was a spiritual and religious show. And it was by far the biggest painting in the show, if I remember right. And just for scale makes it hard to miss, right?
Right.
If nothing else. But it was so interesting, the contrast. Some people would walk by it and not even turn their head,
Yeah.
not even stop to look at it.
Yeah.
And other people would cry in front of it.
Yeah.
You know, and other people, I'd see them looking at it for 10 minutes and then coming back 20 minutes later and looking at it more, or bringing someone back to see it and just sitting there and staring for a long time. But then you contrast that with the people that wouldn't even turn their heads to look at it.
Yeah.
So it makes me think, is it a subjective thing? I mean, because to at least a handful of people, maybe more, my painting certainly wasn't fine art to them. Like that, but then,
Well, I mean,
then the other
definitely-
half of the people, maybe according to your definition, it was fine art. I mean, it
Well,
brought
there
them
were
back with a crowd.
definitely- It's a very good, question, because it has to do with the other part of this equation is not just what the artist creates and puts into it and what the artwork can sustain, but what the viewer brings to it with who they are. Right.
Right.
And,
Right.
I've recently started listening to blues music. Right. And I am not very familiar with the lexicon of blues, but the more I'm listening to it, the more I realize how stupid I am, how little I know about it, right?
Why
And
is that?
how casually I was listening to it, because I didn't really understand, what the classics were, who the most influential people were. It's like you
Oh,
can't
okay.
you can't and those things are important. It's like you could take somebody who's eaten McDonald's all their entire life to a Michelin star restaurant and they won't like it as much as McDonald's because it's not as salty or sugary. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Right. And so it doesn't mean that the Michelin star food is not complicated and deep on many levels. It means that the person who was tasting it didn't have the capability to understand it. Right. And so that's another part of the equation. But I'm talking like in kind of like a middle of the road scenario of like, I think as a middle of the road, you could take a Banksy, and for most people, I mean, there are art historians who've probably made careers writing about Banksy, right? But for most people, you're not going to get a whole lot more out of it. So this is my definition of the difference between fine art and non-fine art. Now, add illustration to that. To me, the definition of illustration is that it's text dependent on some level, right? So it means that it's meant to accompany or deepen a text, right? And so you've got, so in that interpretation, all religious art that's based on scripture is an illustration,
Yeah.
right? And all work that is of classical texts like Homer or or Virgil, all of those, or Ovid, those are all on some level illustrations, because it requires a certain level of education and knowing of what the text is to interpret the work, right? And now you apply the first thing I was talking about. Does that work of art take you many layers deeper into the text than you thought you could go before? Does you look at that work and say, "Oh my gosh, now I think of the text differently"?
Mm.
Or do you look at that work and we're like, "Oh, yeah, that's the text," and then you move on? That's the Banksy non-fine art version of illustration to me. And the difference between illustration that's good and illustration that's bad in my mind, I mean, we've talked about this before. The definition back in the 17th century and 16th century and during the Renaissance of what fine art was the highest rung of that ladder of the finest artists were people who were doing figurative work that was history paintings, allegories, or religious, all
Mhm.
all based on text, right? Because it showed the artist was interpreting complicated, deep subject matter that educated people read at a time when like 10% of the population was literate,
Mm.
right? And so, is it an insult to say that somebody is an illustrator? No, but I think that illustration comes our definition, the way we think of it now, comes from pulp magazine and book creation at the turn of the century when magazines were the antithesis of what literature was. They were just like they were not important. And as an artist, you made a living creating forgettable, for full circle what we were talking about, journalism equivalent of art, right? Stuff that would just be like thrown out the door,
Right.
and forgotten the next day. But it was also created at a very high skill level. If you just said Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel is an illustration of the Bible, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's kind of comical.
It's
Yeah.
for some people it would seem like that was an insult, but really, like my definition, illustration is something that takes the text and it's text dependent on some level,
Mhm.
right? Abstract art is
So
not text dependent.
so
Abstract art is not at
Michelangelo
all.
was an illustrator who rose to a fine artist. So he could be both, is what you're saying.
Yeah, he could be both. But I mean, is Banksy an illustrator? No, he's not
No,
an
of course not.
illustrator. Is he a fine artist? Depending on, according to my definition, he's not, because it's not
Yeah.
something that stimulates deeper thought. But for some people, pop art like Andy Warhol, Lichtenstein, some of these other people who are creating popish type things, there's a protest in it, which is the deep in and of itself, right? The fact that it's protest
Mhm.
is deep. Anyway, in the works that I'm going to show you today, we've got
That
some
was quite the
illustrations.
introduction, man.
We've got some illustrations.
Yeah, we're 40
near
minutes
the end.
in already.
Yeah,
That was fun talking about that.
yeah,
All
man.
right, let's look at the work that you brought today. I
So let's
jumped.
go to the absolute number one. Okay. So I'm going to make you guess on some of these what the subject is.
Oh gosh, you're gonna show my ignorance. Oh well,
No,
obviously
no,
it's
no, no.
nativity.
It's the Nativity.
Yeah.
So this was done by someone who's considered, for many, the basis of all Italian and Renaissance art. This is Giotto.
Mm.
He lived in the about the mid 13th century, 1200s to the early 14th century or 1300s, and he was trained by an artist named Cimabue. And this is part of a series. If you go to the image that's right next to it, you can see that it was done for a chapel. That's what the chapel looks like on the
Wow, that's
interior.
cool.
And it's probably it's one of the most famous works in all of Western art. I've never actually
The
been to
chapel or that
the chapel
painting?
itself. The chapel, because of the painting.
Okay.
It's called the Scrovegni Chapel. It's in Padua, which is just outside of Venice, and it's all painted directly onto the walls in gesso. And it took him I think we've got an exact number. I wrote it down. It was 665
Wait,
days.
you said in gesso. Did you mean fresco?
Fresco. Yeah, gesso. Yes, that's what I
Okay.
meant. You're right.
Okay.
So it's fresco, and it was done in 665 days. Now that's the actual final painting process, because you in how it would work in this world. I don't know if you've ever painted
Did he have help?
in
It's
fresco.
only 2 years. No, I've never painted a fresco.
Yes, he did. He did have help. And how it would have worked is, and the process is fascinating. If we had time to watch a video, I'd show it to you. But just in short, what would happen is he would plan out this whole program. One half of the chapel is the life of Christ, and another half of the chapel is the life of Mary, the Virgin.
Hmm.
And every panel is a moment in each of their lives on either side. And
How do
he
you get that
would
much content for Mary? There's just not that much there.
well, if you're Catholic or if you're Orthodox, there's a lot of content. So there's
Oh.
she also had a miraculous birth, and then there's the education of the Virgin, and then there's the calling of the Virgin. There are all kinds of moments in her life.
Okay. Yeah,
So-
fair enough.
So Giotto would have done all the drawings on probably gridded out paper. After he had done studies and everything, he would have had a final drawing, and then he would have taken that final drawing and poked holes in all the principal lines. And then he would have gotten a bag that was like cheesecloth and filled it with graphite,
Hmm.
or some kind of
Or
colored
charcoal powder or
substance,
something.
charcoal, right? And then he would have put onto the wet fresco, and it's called a giorno. You can only paint into fresco while it's wet. So a giorno is 1 day's worth of painting. You have to work really quickly, right?
Hmm.
So maybe it's 1/4 of one of those panels. I'm not exactly sure what it is for his sake, but you've got that limitation of what you can do before it dries. You powder over the top of the drawing, which is laid over the fresco. Then you quickly take the piece of paper off. You connect up all the lines, and then you fill in all the colors.
Hmm.
Right? And you've got very limited time to do it. So the part that took 665 days or around there was that. It wasn't all the preparatory drawing. It was just the painting into the fresco that took 665 days.
Oh,
And
so it was a lot longer than that, probably.
Yes. So he did this in his mid-30s. This is considered his greatest work. And what it did, go to the individual painting again. If our theme is Christmas, right? So we're talking about Christmas images here. You've got to, there are a few ways to talk about his work. One is to say that what changed the world because of Giotto is the before Giotto, these kind of narrative paintings of multi-figures telling stories were largely done in illuminated manuscripts and books.
Hmm.
And that is probably the best thing to compare what he's doing. The world before that he lived in, churches were decorated with frescoes and with mosaics, but they were Byzantine in nature. They were very frozen, not multi-layered. They were just like single figures or grouped figures together that weren't overlapping or telling stories with gestures or dynamic situations.
Mm-hmm.
But the work that was going on in illuminated manuscripts, like medieval manuscripts, was very exciting and interesting. And he kind of blows that up and puts it on walls with his own style, right? And he's also making things more three-dimensional, and he's doing things with luxurious materials. So here you've got, Mary who's laying on a cot with the Christ child next to her who's recently been born, and angels who are above the structure that she's in. It's not meant to be realistic space, right? This is not him going out and observing what an actual structure looks like, or there are some nods to it. Like people recognize what the animals look like. That's what a donkey looks like. That's what sheep and rams look like on some level. But it's more that he's telling this story as part of a series of stories writ large. And his nativity becomes the way that people start doing the nativity and they start riffing off of him and his approach up until contemporary times. I mean, like, this is what you see on lawns, right? You see like a little bit of a structure and
Now I'm not
Mary,
going to be able to unsee that.
right?
It
And
does look
Mary
like a
sitting
lawn
there.
setup.
I mean, he's really the basis for the Renaissance.
Yeah.
Even that they're talking about him 100 to 200 years later, everyone makes a pilgrimage who's an artist. You've got Titian, Raphael, Michelangelo. They all go to Giotto's Scrovegni chapel and look at
Hmm.
how he told a story. And looking at it, I mean, look at how brilliant his color composition is. How he draws your eye around things.
Yeah,
He's
what's
not
left
working.
of it.
He's not working with many colors. Yeah, and there's not, and it's worse for wear, right?
Yeah.
But just look at that interesting mountain structure, how it's bright in the foreground, dark where Mary is, and she's popping out from that with her bright skin, the Christ child's bright skin. If we were there, we would see it glittering gold around their heads. That's why the halos are there, right? But notice how he's dark into the background in the mountain around them, but has
Yeah.
also small little highlights in that area to keep it interesting as a texture, right? It's little things like that that like it's almost like there are little folds and ripples in that mountain behind Mary. That
Do you
is,
think
go ahead.
now here's the craftsman talking. Do you think that maybe he didn't finish it and he came back in with blue paint after the fresco was dry?
I think that he deliberately, yeah, I mean, there are many layers that happen in a fresco. It's not just what's painted into but after the fresco's dried, you can paint on top of that too.
Yeah, because I just
And
wonder
that's,
why the blue is the only degraded
yeah.
pigment.
And the blue is the most expensive pigment here because it's lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli came from Afghanistan along the Silk Road.
Yeah.
And it was 2 or 3 times more expensive than gold, and it was called ultramarine because it came from ultra, beyond, marine, the sea. And um, yeah, it's definitely there. It is definitely something that would have been the most carefully applied and probably the last applied to have the most undiluted color. And what if you would have seen? I mean, like, go back to the image of
The whole
of the whole
chapel.
chapel. Look at how much lapis lazuli is in that sky, that whole thing, right? I mean, that is a lot of ultramarine, right?
Hmm.
And it was by far the more expensive than his time as an artist, or even building the chapel itself, was that color.
Hmm. And it's peeling everywhere.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just, it's the nature of these things. They, over time, if it had been an oil painting, which didn't happen for a couple more centuries, the lapis lazuli would have been more stable because it would have been suspended in oil, and it wouldn't have been subject to oxidization in the same way.
I don't know.
Um,
I guess because I'm a painter, I just love to get in the heads of the painters and just try and teleport back into their time and imagine how it was put together. I mean, I wonder if because it was so expensive, perhaps, that he finished the whole project and then his patrons like, the blues arrived, let's get all the blue put in. Because it's just
well,
so strange that that's the only color that's peeling on this whole thing.
it was something that was part of the original contract. We actually have the original contract
Oh, so it
that he
wasn't
would
a
put that
afterthought.
much, so it wasn't an afterthought. But I mean,
Huh.
look at some of these things that like clearly people would have gone in there at the time and been like, "Holy cow, there's so much lapis lazuli in here." Right?
Yeah.
This is so expensive. And then they would have said how much gold is in there too. And as an artist, his job was also to make it compositionally interesting. So notice how each of these panels is different from one another. Some of them lead into one another with their shapes.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, if you've got one work after another standing right next to one another, and every one of them has to be different and interesting, it is a very, very difficult task.
Yeah, tell me about it. I know that well.
You do know that well. I mean,
Yeah.
and he's not doing the decorative panels in between, but he's probably collaborating, right? But it's, there's he would have known the color layout from the very beginning of how it was going to look. And notice there are only a few colors, because all the colors he's using are really mineral colors that last. They're not organic.
Mm.
So he's using that green as a copper sulfate derivative. He's using, the red it could come from a lot of different things. And he's got the lead white that he's using. Excuse me. So he's really kind of got about 8 mineral colors.
Yeah, it's pretty
And
simple.
so he's using those very carefully and alternating between them to tell a story. I mean, you could pick any one of these panels and you can see how he's alternating those colors to tell the story. And if I were to bring up for you any one of the Renaissance masters that came after him 100 years later, they are absolutely looking at how Giotto uses color to pull the eye throughout a piece. How, he'll have a very bright red in one place, or if blue is your dominant color because it's what the patron wants to show off as being. I mean, imagine a patron comes to you, Jeff, and says, I want to show off, and I want you to use the most expensive pigment imaginable as the predominant color. And I want you to still tell the story, even though this color is so dominant, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a challenging thing, right? To say blue is going to be your dominating color throughout this, but you've got to tell the story through other colors, knowing that blue is 70% of everything in front of you.
Well, I mean, to be fair, though, he's lucky in that the expensive color happens to be in the sky. Like,
That's true.
It's pretty. If it was red, God, that would be tough.
Yeah.
That'd be too much red.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next one. It couldn't be any more different. I want you to guess what the subject of this painting is.
I feel like I should know it, but give me a sec here.
You won't know.
I won't
You
know.
won't know. No.
Yeah, I
you
have no
shouldn't know.
idea.
It's deliberately tricky. It's
What is it?
gonna mess you up.
I love this little dude. What is he doing? Paddling on a stream under the bridge?
Okay, so
That's a trip.
this is by Peter Bruegel, and this is the Adoration of the Magi
Okay.
in winter. So let me back up here. The Catholic Church dominated painting and the visual arts for a very, very long time. And then in the mid 16th century, or the early 16th century, you started to get in the north of Europe, the Reformation. And the Reformation was largely driven by Protestants who believed that the Catholic Church's interpretation of heaven. I mean, one of the criticisms of the Protestants was that the Catholic Church had supported the wealthy and not the poor for such a long time that a lot of the doctrine was, you're poor in this life, but you're going to be wealthy in the next life, right? So don't worry about being poor in this life, because God values poverty and humility, and in the meantime, the Catholic Church is filling all of their chapels with very wealthy, sumptuous works of art that depict people in wealthy robes, eating, drinking, doing, living these lascivious lifestyles that 95% of the Catholic Church could not live, right? So the moment Protestants get in their hands biblical subjects, their reaction to that is to take and do the opposite. Instead of lapis lazuli, gold painted images of people who were kings standing in front of Mary, who was dressed in blue robes on a sumptuous wall. You've got an everyday village in the Netherlands in winter with everyday people and everyday things, and the Magi have shown up in the bottom left,
Yeah, I
kneeling,
just barely found it.
kneeling in front of Mary, and the main point of this painting is to say Christ in the gospel is about everyday life and about what happens to us in everyday life. So if we're going to depict gospel subjects, we're going to do it in the most common, mundane way, even to the point that just like we need to find Christ and Christ-like activity and themes in everyday life, I'm going to hide this usually very sumptuous and overt subject in a boring everyday life scene.
Hmm. You know what I find interesting about it is it's like, where did you say this took place? In Netherlands?
The Netherlands, yeah,
And they're not hiding it. They're not even trying to make it look like Israel.
that's right.
It's so interesting.
Well, and it's that idea that you're supposed to make the gospel, we would say in our culture, you're supposed to liken it unto yourself, right? You're
Right.
supposed to take this subject and you're supposed to make it as if you are living in the Bible,
And I
right?
like that.
Your
Yeah.
understanding. And the difference between the people that Bruegel was painting for and who people like Giotto and Raphael were painting for is that Giotto and the Italian Renaissance painters were doing mostly large scale paintings for public spaces. And the people who were buying Protestant works of art from Bruegel are buying them to have in their home in a small scale. And so they also wanted to see themselves in these paintings, these everyday merchants. I mean, think of the Dutch East India Company, traders, merchants are the people buying it, not nobility. And they were called cabinet paintings. A cabinet was your room. And instead of hanging it on the wall with a light, it was usually something that you kept you would pick up and hold on your lap
Really?
and you'd look at and you'd share it with your friends. And sometimes you'd even pull out a magnifying glass. And part of the party trick of this painting was to guess what the subject was and to find the main characters in it, right? So usually there are all kinds of silly details in it, like people slipping on the ice, or somebody who's like in the background, who's carrying a loaf of bread that's out of season or fruit that's out of season, and you're supposed to like find all these anachronisms and silly little
Hmm.
details in the painting. And it's almost like our equivalent of a high-end Where's Waldo
I was just
for
thinking that. Yeah.
for people at the time. But dude, and I use dude because I just love the word dude. I've got a little bit of it in there. I like dude. Look at the compositional genius of it though.
It's
The
really nice.
compositional genius is there are probably 40 or 50 figures in this piece. It's not very big. It's roughly like 18 by 30 inches. And the fact that this main subject is purportedly at the left, right,
Right.
in the bottom left, but you're pulled into the depth of the painting away from the principal subject that's supposedly the principal subject, and that he deliberately did it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that wall leads you down to that stick that's holding up the corner of that building that's falling down, and just the trees that are crossing over one another, the buildings that go all the way back, the figures that are like layered on layered on layered, like Disney cell animation, right? There's like a
Mm-hmm.
foreground, there's like 5 middle grounds, there's a background. It's just he's so brilliant with his details. And the amazing thing about him is that he was trained at a time when most of the work that was going on in the Netherlands was book art and illustration that was flat. And he goes to Italy on kind of his own grand tour. He's very aware of what Titian, Raphael, Veronese, and the other people are doing at his time. And the only thing he arguably brings to it is the perspective.
Yeah.
Everything else is completely a rejection of that Italian approach to things. It's just like, I mean, almost everything leads away from the main subject.
Yeah, it's weird because it does, but then eventually it brings you down. Because eventually you follow the crowd down to the main subject, but it took me forever to get down here.
Yeah. And that's why I said you shouldn't feel stupid. It's designed. He did that to people at the time too. It's part of the fun of it. I mean, isn't that fun? It's fun, right?
It's really cool. No, I feel dumb just because of my lack of art history knowledge. I'm a complete moron, which is why I have you as a friend. You can help me out.
Come on. I'm going to show you another image by him. Go to the next one.
Okay.
It's not
This
that
is him?
one. No, go to there are two more winter scenes. Okay. Not that one, but another one that looks just like it. No. Go to the other one. Go to the other one that you just had.
Okay.
There are two that are the exact same. Okay. This one is a very troubling image. We've talked about this in the past, this image during our last Christmas episode. And I want you to guess again what this is.
Oh my gosh. We talked about this? I don't even remember.
Not
my
this
memory
painting,
is terrible.
We talked about this subject.
So
if you think about the Christmas story, notice just some of the elements that are in this. There are there's soldiers. And
is this when they were killing all the kids, 2-year-olds?
This is the massacre of the innocents.
Really?
So for those who don't know this subject, one of the main elements in the story of the birth of Christ is that the three wise men, who we don't know where they come from, are just wise men. It doesn't say in the New Testament that there are three of them. They arrive to the palace of Herod because apparently they're diplomatically important enough that they're going to be hosted by a king. And they basically give away the game that the person who's supposed to be the new king of the Jews has been born, and they're going after him. So Herod hears this, and he knows that the star that appeared at Christ's birth has been there for 3 years. So he sends his troops to Bethlehem, because that's also prophesied in the book of Micah. Thank you very much. You can thank me later. Right? You're welcome. And he sends his troops to go kill any children that are below the age, or 3 or under, since the star appeared. Now, interestingly enough, there's something like, it's one of the most sacred relics in the Catholic Church, and there are over 1,000 bones or bodies of, somebody did a study of this, of innocents, quote unquote innocents that were killed. But the Roman census was so good that we know roughly how many people died. It was somewhere between 12 and 18 children that were killed.
Oh, so the population wasn't huge.
No, it wasn't huge of the people that were in there. But I put in two versions of this painting because it's interesting. The Bruegel family, which was started by Peter Bruegel the Elder, he kind of creates his own family factory where there's Peter Bruegel the Elder, Peter Bruegel the Younger, Jan Bruegel, and Jan Bruegel the Elder, and Jan Bruegel the Younger. I think there are 4, maybe even 5 generations of Bruegels. And the father, Peter Bruegel, creates some templates that are continued by the 3 or 4 generations, and some of them invent them. Now, this one, I put up 2 here on purpose, because in one of them, all the children are being massacred. And in the other one, the Pope, who bought the work because the Bruegels were so famous, ordered that one of his Italian artists paint over all the dead children and turn them into loaves of bread, sacks of food, because he felt like it was such a terrible thing. So if you see that woman that's in the middle with something that's sitting down, one of them is a child.
Sick right there.
So if you can zoom in on it, one of them, I think this may be it, is a child that's just been killed by the soldiers. I think that's the one. Yep. So that's a child that's been killed.
Right there.
Right. Now go to the other image and zoom in on the same spot.
Oh my gosh. That's wild. And then right here too, this bag.
Yep. Yep.
That
And
was a kid right there.
so it's interesting because um this painting was so controversial in its time, even though the same Pope had bodies
Wait, did they
apparently
change the
of the
original or
relics,
just
right?
paint it again?
No, painted over it. He ordered it to be painted over. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. And so what's interesting about that is that Bruegel's work was seen as so valuable from an originality standpoint of composition, design, and being clever, that the Pope didn't care about actually changing the subject by covering over the dead children, because what mattered to him was the artistry and not the content.
What the heck? I don't understand how they get a picture of both versions.
Well, this is the thing, is that the Bruegels um painted, they're probably, I think there are as many as 10 of these, but there's
Oh,
only
okay.
one that was painted over. So
Oh, okay.
usually, like, if you there, the Bruegels were like a factory in some ways. You'd go there and you could order, you'd go into their studio and they would have the original of each one, right? So they would have, he had all kinds of great fun paintings. And the Pope ordered one, and it was sent to Italy. And when he saw the dead bodies of the children, and I think he ordered it from the son of the father who was still producing them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the Pope, when it got there, he ordered all of the things to be painted over by his own artists.
Jeez. Dude, it's
He's a,
dark when you start really looking at it.
yeah, I mean, and think about, I mean, once again, let's just talk about this from an
Oh,
artistic
wait, they missed a
perspective.
kid.
Did they?
Look at this. Okay, here it is right here. See these two right here?
Oh yeah. And that kid's hanging and he's dead.
They're right
They
there.
did.
They're
They
still
did.
there, and he's even got his pants off.
Yeah, and you see how the
Why would they
soldier
not
is,
fix that? They even got the goose in the bag.
I don't know.
Oh, that's weird. How do they miss that?
I don't know. I don't know.
Talk about Where's Waldo. This is
But yeah,
fun.
you can see the appeal of his art. And if you talk about, dude, let's just take a second and talk about the composition from a color perspective. Look at how the red is handled against the white, and how the red is dotted throughout the work in a way that pulls you from the very foreground all the way throughout the composition, from left to right and from foreground to background. That red, which is on the soldiers in the foreground, the woman
Mm-hmm.
that's in the middle, there's a little bit on like on the horses, there's some on the right, they're on the buildings that are on either side of the piece. There is a little bit in the very back of the painting. I mean, it's just the thing that the Bruegels excelled at is, it's almost like they there was this great story years ago that I read about. It was an interview with Bouguereau, who could be not more different than the Bruegels, right?
Yeah.
Bouguereau would send a work to the Paris Salon and sell it, and then he knew that he'd have to make 3 or 4 copies of it in different sizes, and that's one of the ways he made money. And he goes into the studio, he's in the studio and he's being interviewed after one of these big events, and he's making one of his copies. And the woman who interviewed him for the American Women's Literary Magazine, or Literary Arts Magazine, that I was reading this in, said, Monsieur Bouguereau, don't you get bored repainting your own work? And he said, oh, no, 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 no. He said, my favorite part is the very last inch, I think he said, where you have to choose what to highlight, what to knock back, what to pull forward. And when I look at the Bruegels, the father's work isn't always the best, because they've done 3 generations and so many iterations that they really hone in on where the red should be, where the white should be, where the green should be, where this should be. And so, like, one of the endless things that's fun about it is, imagine somebody did a high-end Where's Waldo and did it 20 times, and by the 20th time, like, it is so brilliantly composed and everything is so tight, and I mean, that's what is the joy of looking at a great Bruegel painting, is that endless thousands of tiny decisions being made that are pulling you around the whole painting. It's brilliant.
So just so I understand, there's at least 10 of these out there.
Yeah.
So how did that work? Did they just have a really positive reception and then more people would come and order one?
Yeah,
Or
I
did they
mean,
present 10 and sell 10 right from the start?
so this is no, so it was like you would have how artists were regulated were what were called guilds. And so you'd have to apprentice with a member of the guild,
Mm-hmm.
and then you'd have to become a journeyman, just like you do in like today as an electrician or a plumber, right?
Right.
And then you would have to do your master's exam, and then you would pay dues to be a member of the guild, and you would have your own studio. And when you were doing the guild had a monopoly over art. So let's say that you're doing a chapel or building a home and you wanted to commission a work of art, you would go to the guild and say, I want to go to a guild artist to paint a work, and I want the theme of our church is the massacre of the or is the innocents,
Mm-hmm.
and I want a painting of the massacre of the innocents. Who in your guild has painted this subject? And then you'd go to the different masters and you'd be able to choose, and you'd go into Bruegel's studio and he'd be a little quirky and different, and maybe he'd be famous because the Pope bought his painting, right? And you'd you'd say, I want that one, but it needs to be 30% larger, or I'm not going to pay for lapis lazuli, so I want cobalt, which is a cheaper blue instead. I don't have the money for lapis lazuli. And so you'd literally create a contract like you were working with a plumber that would say, I'm going to do this, and I want the full Bruegel with the best materials, or I want Bruegel's journeyman, who's the assistant, to do 90% of it, and Bruegel to just do the faces and hands. And so you'd kind of like, they wouldn't really, things like this are discovered all the time. We don't always know how many Bruegel did. We know that his most popular subject was, he did a lot of Garden of Eden paintings, and there are like 40 of them, right? And we're discovering new ones all the time. It wasn't like he limited them. It's just whoever came in and paid for him, right?
Wow, it's a different world.
Different worlds.
You know what I'm thinking about as I'm looking at these paintings? If
What's
I
that?
lived long enough, it'd be crazy to do the series I'm doing again,
Yeah.
but in contemporary clothing, with contemporary architecture. Because it's not even just in the Netherlands, it's also their dress.
Yeah.
It's modern for their time. Everything.
Yeah.
It would have
Yeah.
been so weird to look at for them in a way.
Yeah.
They're like, that's us,
Yeah.
not Christ's time. Yeah, it'd be
It's
an interesting series.
and I mean, and that is part of the joy of the contrast of this Protestant art, is that you see all of these ambitious projects that are being done by Giotto, by Michelangelo, in this huge scale with a huge team of artists with the highest quality materials. And then you go to the north and you see this painting of really like mundane, arguably, subjects. I mean, like interesting subjects in mundane atmospheres, and that is part of what makes them so interesting.
Yeah,
right? It's like
they really are.
Okay, so
Yeah.
there's an image that's the fourth one in from the right that I want you to go to. Others, yeah, go all the way
I'm
to
left.
the
Sorry. Duh.
yeah,
That
one.
Okay.
Okay, so the artist who did this is Heinrich Galtzius. He was a contemporary of Bruegel. He was working in the north, and he is the greatest engraver who ever lived, arguably.
Why?
And I'm not just saying that. I'm going to show you why.
Okay.
So he did about, I think we know of 88 works that he did. Is that right? Let me see. I've got a list here of 388. Okay. So You got to remember that he's working during a time which is the first mass-produced print era. The printing press was invented in what, the late 1400s. He lives he's born about 50 to 60 years after that. And he is not working in wood, he's working in metal. And he uses what's called a burin. And a burin is one of those really like hard styluses that you're cutting into metal with. And he invents a lot of techniques that become the basis for pretty much the print media for the rest of the world up until even now, in the way that line and shadowing and cross hatching is essentially an invention by him,
No
right?
kidding.
So go to the next image, which is his hand. He had an accident when he was a boy in fire, and the accident created a hand that was malformed and permanently fixed in this position.
Get out of town.
I'm not kidding. And his hand was particularly suited in that malformed state to hold a burin or one of the styluses.
Are you serious?
To the point that people wanted a reproduction of his hand, which he did in order to show people like what he was working with in order to create his works. Now I've got two images where I go into they're up closes of the image I just showed you and it's Christmas themed because it's the adoration. It's an unfinished piece.
Are we looking at an engraving for an engraving?
Yeah, of an engraving. So there's this one. Oh, is that the up close? It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is one of the women who's looking over the Christ child. I think it's actually Mary herself. I want you to go into her cheek. Okay. He created something that's called the dot and lozenge effect. And he also created the thick and thin line approach. So if you look at his work, his lines, which is the same line, can start off thin and then become very thick in the middle, almost like a calligraphic line, like in calligraphy. That wasn't done before him. And this dot approach of dotting things, look at the cross-hatching on her right cheek in the shoulder of that guy. Notice how there's cross-hatching with dots inside of it.
Wait, the shoulder of that guy? You talking about over here?
Yep. Kind of his shoulder. Yeah, or like lower arm. Notice that that's
dashes
called
through here.
See how he's creating these different shadow effects? Because when you're working as a burin artist or as what's the word we use? We use this print culture. We're calling
Intaglio?
Intaglio is another word for it. Another word for it is
etcher,
engraving. When you're engraving, like this, right?
Right.
You only really have to work with the absence of a line or the inclusion of a line, right? That's it. You can't really change. You don't have color to work with, and your value is controlled by the closeness of the lines or the way that you've put down the line.
Right.
And he's the one who created these very complicated ways of cross-hatching, thinning and thickening lines, dotting. The brightest part in the whole painting is the candle. So go to the up close of the candle shot. I've got another up close. And notice how he shows brightness.
Candle shot.
Yeah, there's one of them that's an up close.
I don't see another engraving.
Oh, keep going. There's one. You're right there. I think right there. No,
there's no other engraving
maybe just
here.
go to the original, the very big one. There you are.
Yeah, that's a pretty good file anyway.
Notice
that's a detail. My bad.
Yeah, notice how he's created the brightest part in the whole painting.
I just have to take a minute to thank each one of my generous patrons for your part in keeping this podcast going. I could not continue to do it without you, so thank you so much. If you're not a patron yet, but you love the show and you listen regularly, please consider becoming a patron. It's really easy to do, and it doesn't have to break the bank. Just head over to theundrapedartist.com and click on the link Be My Patron on Podbean. And then choose a monthly donation amount that fits your budget. It's that simple.
Just left out anything.
He's
Left
just
out any lines.
And then look at the guy who's the darkest figure, which is the one on the far left. that's right next to the candle, right? Look at how he's created the idea of a candle lighting up that scene. It's insane. He's
Yeah,
done
that is
that
pretty cool.
with, I mean, and look at the folds in front of him, how he's created highlights in those folds. He's done
Mm-hmm.
it by the absence of any line, and then with some of them, there's extremely sharp and deep lines, or lots of cross hatching and lots of dotting that he's done to create it. If you want as an artist, if you want to study how someone has controlled value in a painting,
Mm-hmm.
studying an engraver like Goltzius is I think one of the best ways to do it, because he's working with the fewest amount of factors.
Yeah,
Right?
I've tried engraving. It's not easy.
And he's considered the greatest who ever lived, arguably.
You know, it's interesting, and this is maybe a silly observation and maybe not even terribly interesting to anybody but me, but is he really follows either across contour or with the contour with his hatching.
Oh, interesting.
Everywhere. So he's following form either with or across contours. But there's
that's
just a
really
few
interesting
places
insight.
like in the neck where he gets a little more chaotic and just starts to stack hatching marks that aren't necessarily all following. I guess they're sort of following the form, but for some reason it just feels a little more chaotic here, where everywhere else, like in the hair or in the scarf or whatever along this fabric, it's all very, very deliberate. Then in here, it's just, he's really just scratching away. Tiny little dashes instead of long lines, tiny little dashes.
You know, up until the end of the middle of the 19th century, before photography took over,
Yeah.
Engraving artists were sent to the same schools and did all the same work as painters and sculptors until the last year when they were introduced. So they would do all the drawing, they would do all the same figure studies, everything, and then they would be introduced to the styluses and Burin work, and almost every one of them was given Goltzius as their model that they needed to follow. And people, there were a lot of engraving collectors up until the turn of the century, the 19th to the 20th century. And I mean, to me, I collect engravings. An engraving like this would arguably sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Wow. That's insane.
They were so rare, and they're so well done, and it's so well preserved. And Rembrandt did a lot of work about 100 years after. He worshipped Goltzius.
But he didn't engrave, he etched. There's a difference, right? Engraving is where you literally dig out a line, and etching's where you put
and
it in a
etching is
bath.
where you kind of do it into a clay that's over the metal, and then you use acid to eat into the lines you've
and
exposed.
Sometimes you can do
So it is
dry
different.
point. You can do dry point, but it's a scratching, where engraving is more of like it's more of a chisel, if I understand correctly.
Well, he's digging, he's scraping the metal. Yeah, he's scraping the metal as he goes with a very sharp tool. So he's doing it right onto the metal and not into a clay that's then eaten away by the acid. But Rembrandt's probably the most prolifically reproduced. And the way that Rembrandt's are valued, his etchings, I have 2 or 3 in my own collection.
Wait, originals?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, they were done from his plates because
done from his plates, but not from his hand.
Every time the ink that's used to ink these plates is slightly corrosive. And so, they eat away at the clarity of the line over time. So you can ink with one plate, arguably like 3 to even 10,000 times. But by the time you do 9,999, the edges of the lines are really blurry and the clarity's gone. So the difference between a Rembrandt etching that was inked during the very end of its run, which was happening long after he died. I mean, they were inking them until the end of the 19th century.
Really?
300 years after he died, 200 and something years after he died. Those are a few $100s each versus the ones that were part of the first 100 or 1,000 runs. Those are worth hundreds of thousands, So Goltzius, and sometimes the plates were destroyed because they were made on copper, which was a metal that was expensive, So you would, you'd melt down a plate and you'd remake them. And so some of them were only inked like 30 or 40 times. So the value of these things is not is hard to determine. But I mean, dude, look at that. Isn't that amazing?
Well,
Isn't
look at the
amount of
hair.
work
Look
in
at the
that?
difference in text. Whoops, what'd I do? Where is it? The difference in texture.
Yeah.
That beautiful serpentine long lines for the curly long hair. And then
Yeah.
this is so cool. This texture is awesome. It really
And
feels like a crew cut, kind of.
we know that he worked under magnifying glasses too. So
Really?
I mean, none of these blocks that he's working on can be very large because they've got to be large enough to go on a produced piece of paper, which is not huge. I mean, it's usually smaller than an 8.5 by 11 size.
Hmm.
And so he's got to have a lot of control, the control of a surgeon, right?
Yeah.
And he's got to control it on a really microscope. And you can't correct a plate once a line's been done. You have to kind of start over.
No, you can. You can.
Can you?
Yeah, there's a
Can you fill it in?
burnishing. No, it's a
Oh, that's
burnishing
right. You
tool
can
and a
burnish, you're
scraping
right.
tool. You can scrape it down to fresh plate again.
Yeah. Ignore the art historian here. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
You're right.
But
You're absolutely right.
you can't do it very much. I mean, it's still a pretty fragile process.
To me, the thing that's so interesting is that he's creating the lines which are the negative. He knows that what he's cutting into or scraping is the place where the ink goes. So he's already doing a negative process on some level, right? But then the brightest part of the scene has got to be the one with the least amount of lines. So he's thinking in very complicated terms about how he's controlling value as he's doing negative drawings. It's
reversed. That's the other frustrating thing about printing. You draw it and then you print it and it's reversed.
Yeah.
So that reveals a lot of drawing errors in my case.
He's a contemporary of Bruegel. They knew one another. And both of them had been to Italy, and they derive entirely different lessons. So Goltzius, his works stylistically span a lot of different things, but you can tell he understands figurative work. He's looking at the Italian approach to storytelling and figures. These are very Italianate folds in the clothing and faces, and it's very classical, as we would call it today, right? He's not doing Protestant peasants. This is anything that an Italian would recognize as being similar in style to what they're doing, but he's doing it through a medium which is very Protestant, which is prints, because Italy doesn't have the printing press. Look at that hand, man, that's holding the candle. Holy cow.
It's awesome.
I mean, it is just unbelievable, isn't it?
It is. So I'm looking at the lines down here. That's just artifacts in the paper, right?
Yeah, I think
this stuff here.
I don't know enough. I should have done my homework. I think he obviously finished.
Because that looks like an etched line, and these are obviously etched lines. But this, you see them up here too.
I think if we were looking at this as like a Rockwell or a Leyendecker, we would say, "Oh, that's the space where text would have been." But I don't think that's the case. I think that
I think it's just
maybe
unfinished.
it is. Maybe it's either unfinished or else
It's a weird thing to cut off a hand like this. It's got to be unfinished.
I mean, look at what it could be a frontispiece. It's probably a frontispiece to a book where that's what it is. Now I remember. There would have been text that went in this that said this is who the book is dedicated to. All of that is fixed inside there, which is a separate plate that was printed on top of this.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Okay, I just got to point this out again because look at, so this is what I mean, just in case you didn't understand or anyone didn't understand. So look at, I can't control my computer. So right here, you see in this apples to apples, see how the neck are long lines that describe the form?
Yes.
And then over here, for some reason, he just sort of dashes, dash, 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 dash.
Yeah.
It's just, he's obviously got a huge range in his methods. Hmm. That's cool,
Yeah.
man.
It's really, it's one of my favorite things ever to see his work. Okay. So now we're going to look at a horizontal drawing by Fra Bartolomeo.
Is it this?
Yep, that's the detail. Go to the larger version of it if you can find it. I think it's closer to the middle.
Here?
There it is.
Oh, you threw me with horizontal. Okay.
So this is sorry, I meant vertical. You're right.
Oh, okay.
This painting never, this is the adoration of the shepherds, and it's a piece that's on paper. This is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It never becomes a painting, but it gives you an idea of how these Italian artists who were working in from the end of the 15th century, the late 1400s to the early 1500s, before there were really schools, but they're looking at classical work. I mean, this is the kind of this is happening in Florence, where they're looking at classical statues from Rome that are being dug up. They're looking at frescoes, and they're kind of inventing a new approach to how scenes are put together. They've seen these Roman figures that are standing sculptures with the contrapposto pose of like weight being borne on different angles, and they're seeing multi-figural sculptural reliefs where figures are overlaying one another a little bit, but they're all different from one another. And they're trying to create in their own way monumental scenes that are different than the stuff Giotto's doing, that isn't based on illuminated manuscript, but more based on what Roman sculpture and even frescoes look like. And this is a time when paper is very expensive. It would often be used for multiple things, or it'd be worked on over a long period of time. And the artist would use this as the basis for whatever painting they were going to do. It's so interesting to me, and I wanted to. We don't often talk about drawings when we talk with artists and old masters. You, in practice as an artist, as a teacher, you're talking about drawings all the time, right? But look at that. He's got the most important figures are in the foreground. It's the Holy Family. Joseph on the left, Mary, the Christ child who's blessing the crowd that's come to see him. There's soldiers that are above the Joseph that's there, that are marching in to kill the innocents, right? But so he's trying to do multiple narratives at once. He's got the most important figures at the center, the brightest light, but he's also got probably hundreds of figures that he's kind of stuffing into this.
What the heck is this?
I don't know, but they're maybe there to point out in the background,
Like a pheasants
as a device,
or something.
The soldiers that are coming in. They're probably on the same level as the soldiers to draw attention to the soldiers, because that huge mountain leads you from the back down to Mary and Joseph, and vice versa. It leads you into the back. But then behind Mary and Joseph, they've got this imaginary building of these participants who are sketched in the most basic way. But isn't it fascinating, their shorthand for figures?
It's really smart.
Super smart, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm not sharing this.
I'm learning a lot from this.
I'm not sharing this because I think that, I mean, Fra Bartolomeo, who did it, was considered. He was trained as a young man, as a seminarian to be a monk, and he actually became a monk. And then Savonarola, who was his hero, who was the main leader of his church in Florence, basically told him that God wanted him to be an artist because he was so talented, and that he should leave the priesthood to become an artist. So then he becomes an artist. He dies at the age of 45, but he was good friends with Raphael. And it's a time in art when there's so much experimentation going on. There's not one way to do things. That to see Fra Bartolomeo think through a piece like this is, to me, one of the great it's before schools get to artists and tell them how to do things.
Hmm.
Right. So look at, but there's so much information in it. I don't think that anyone in the 18th or 19th century would create an image with this kind of shorthand in it. But it's also so darn clear what's going on, even though there's so little information in places.
Yeah. It reminds me sort of Da Vinci's studies for paintings.
Who was probably 20 or 30 years older than him, and Fra Bartolomeo would have absolutely known who he was and would have worshipped him.
Hmm. Yeah.
So there's definitely a relationship between it.
Yeah, that's cool.
To me, the reason I wanted to incorporate it is that I just think that artists should look to these old master drawing studies. And the next image I'm going to show you, which is the red drawing that's in, red chalk.
Red chalk.
Far side. Yeah, there you are getting there. Yep. Which is done
Oh, that's an ink and chalk.
ink and chalk, yes. And it's done this is tip of my tongue here.
I mean, maybe it's not ink. Looks like ink, but
yeah, there's ink in there. Yeah, definitely.
okay.
The artist who did this is oh gosh, tip of my tongue. He's Bartolozzi, who's working 200 years later than the work we just saw. And it's Bartolozzi. You can see he's working in Italy. He's this is just imagine technology has moved 200 years later. And the kinds of concerns that artists have are a little different. Bartolozzi is he's making his career both as a graphic artist who's doing engravings, but he's also turning some of those engravings into paintings. And the thing that's less interesting to him is accuracy in figurative work, and more interesting to him is dramatic gestures in the figures.
And light and shade.
And light and shade is really important here with his work. And you look, a lot of these arms and the way they connect to bodies are not accurate at all. And he doesn't care about accuracy at all. He can accurately draw when he wants to. What's brilliant about Bartolozzi and the artists of this generation is really composition. How he controls value, how he controls gesture. I mean, look at, if you go from Joseph, who's looking to Mary, Mary's arm, up to the little boy who's looking at Mary, the man behind him, all the way, and then you look at the man behind him who's very dark, and then there's somebody behind him who's looking the other way to the person who's holding the tray of food. That is like,
oh, right here. Yeah.
Brilliant composition, because it leads you in a diagonal line all the way up one side, and it breaks a lot of the rules. You're supposed to have kind of like overlying triangles, which you do kind of. I mean, Mary is a triangle with the Christ child, right? But in other ways, this is like a landslide from the right of the painting to the left of the painting.
Yeah.
And the way that he's got these sharp, really high value lines that slash diagonally through the whole thing is brilliant design work. And it doesn't, it goes over the shoulder of the man, to the cheek of the woman, to the shoulder of the woman, to the hip of the woman, to the shoulder and arm of the guy who's in the foreground. It's, that line has nothing to do with what reality looks like. He's highlighting it though in really brilliant, interesting ways that are pre-photograph, right? Post-classicism. This is how people in the 18th century composed images. They were jarring from composite. You can say, oh, it's very conventional in the way that these figures are overlapping. What's totally unconventional is the lights and darks and the gestures. Totally unconventional.
I'm going to put those side by side. You know, what's interesting is when I was looking at the first one of my first thoughts was I couldn't be comfortable composing this way, because to me, a painting is about light and dark shapes. The figures are just, I mean, they're important to the narrative in a multi-figure painting.
Yeah.
But as far as composition goes, the way I think of it is the figures, you have to balance them in a way that you are actually moving the light shapes and the dark shapes in an interesting pattern. It's not so much like I need a figure here, I need a figure there. No, I need a figure there that's in the dark because I need a dark shape there. Or I need some light across the shoulder because I need a light shape there. And then you just got to put the figure, you got to light the figure right to get that pattern. And so this makes a lot more sense to me.
It does. And it's why, and I'm so glad you put it in these terms, because it's, you know, when you look at the history of art as an art historian, and it didn't happen this way until, you know, I've been looking at a lot of old masters over time. I think if you're someone who first approaches old paintings, all of them look to you just like an old painting.
Yeah.
Right? But over time, they start to come out like the difference between an early paint movie with no moving cameras, and then movies that have moving cameras, and then claymation, and then animation, and then CGI, and you start to realize that, oh my gosh, like each one of these technologies builds on one another in order to tell the story, sometimes not in the best way. I mean, it doesn't always get better, but the work that's on the right of Fra Bartolomeo, who's working in the first part of the 1500s, is there are a lot more figures, and you could argue it's more complicated because there's a lot more figures going on in it, possibly, right? But from a compositional standpoint, the one on the left, which is 200 years later, is much more complicated in the way that it's breaking up form, the way that it's thinking about values, the way that it's drawing your eye around the image. Same subject, totally different approaches. The technology has not changed that much, but the way of thinking about how light breaks over figures and darks. The darkest spot is almost in the center of that painting on the left. Like it's almost like right in the center, and it's the darkest spot, which is like an insane reversal of how they were working 200 years earlier. And it works, right? I mean, why is the most important part, that part in the shade? And how on earth is that even in shade in the first place? Like it's so bizarre as a choice when you start to interrogate it a little bit, right? You're like, what, light's coming from behind him and from the Christ child at the same time? What the heck is going on? Right? Like it doesn't make it like that.
And
is
these
so
kids
strange.
are not lit by the same light source as the people behind them.
No,
Well, I suppose they're being shadows cast on them from these figures, but I guess you could say.
I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't really, like, it works as an overall composition. And it's brilliant. It really is like,
Well, you know,
I mean,
David Dibble's one of the great composers of paintings out there, in my opinion.
yes, he
And
is.
he would say, if it looks right, it is right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be realistic. As long as it just feels natural, it's good. That's a hard thing to achieve, though, I find.
I think it is a hard thing because I mean, he's like, look, her elbow does not connect to a real arm or shoulder. Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
but a lot of these drawings are really good, though. Like these little angels or whatever up here.
it's the perfect example of sacrificing, because he could draw very, very accurately when he wanted to.
Yeah.
But he's deliberately doing things for the sake of gesture and composition.
Well, he's brainstorming. This isn't a finished
Yep.
piece. He's just trying to get the composition down. It seems like the first artist was focused mostly on narrative. Tell the story, tell the story, tell the story. Where the second is create a composition, make a beautiful piece.
Yep.
Maybe not.
Now I'm gonna take you to a contemporary of the man who's on the left, who's it's also a vertical painting. It's by maybe one of my top 10 favorite artists of all time.
Okay.
And it's his name is Tiepolo, and he did a lot of frescoes in very large scale. And it's gosh, I don't know if you can see the names. Yeah, it's that one. It's exactly that one.
Okay.
Same subject. He's working at the same time as that artist who was doing the very radical lights and darks. This is a finished painting, and this is the adoration
Wait,
of
wait. This is a finished painting.
Magi.
It's not a study.
That's a finished painting. Yeah.
Really? It looks like a
Yeah.
study.
Yeah, he would do these very radical paintings that were he was more interested in the flow
Hmm.
he's very sketchy, and he worked a lot in fresco, but he worked a lot in oil too. And his one of the genius things that Tiepolo did, and I don't know if anybody in the history of art, maybe Luca Giordano, I don't think anybody painted as much square footage as Tiepolo did. He would do one palace ceiling that was 40,000 square feet,
Jeez.
and he would do it in 6 months with his team. I mean, it was insane, the speed and scale he worked at. And he was a genius, absolute genius of composition.
Mhm.
So, I mean, like, look at how he's got from the Virgin's face that one line that goes all the way down from the Christ over the head and the back of that figure down to the foot in the bottom left. One triangular line that
You
goes
talking about
all
right
the
here?
way down. Yeah. But
Yeah.
he breaks it up with all kinds of shapes and values and colors as he's doing it. And look at how wonky. I mean, she's in this totally imagined classical hellscape. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's all of these like classical things that nothing here has to do with real reality, but she's framed by this pillar that someone's viewing it from the top, and then there's someone even behind him in an archway. And
I don't know. These heads with wings on them are pretty realistic.
Those heads with wings are actually, I think they're in Catholicism. I think are there 9 or 12 or 7 grades of angels, maybe 7, and the cherubim are literally described, I think, in the book of Revelations as being mouths with wings.
Oh.
But then they get taken on at different times as just being heads with wings, because it's unsettling to see mouths with wings.
Yeah,
right?
not like heads with wings.
Right? So, I mean, if you squint, this is one of my favorite things to do with Tiepolo. Squint your eyes while you're looking at it.
Oh, it's brilliant. Like I said, the light and dark pattern. That's
I mean,
it's amazing.
He's one of the most complicated figures when it comes to his control of value in the history of art. And he's done very, very finished works. Look at that elbow of the Magi.
Yeah, right here.
I mean, isn't that
And
the
I
most
love
amazing,
this costume.
Isn't it the most amazing gesture of that guy and how stately he looks?
Yeah.
And how dark his back is. And you can see his hand resting on that hip, which is a ridiculous fold of clothing. And you know what's more interesting than the face of Mary is that clothing that he's got his hand rested on, like those folds. It's more interesting than Mary.
Wait, here you mean?
Like, yeah, that's more interesting to me than the faces of Mary or even the Christ child.
Oh yeah,
Like,
this area is
just like-
the highlight
I mean,
of the painting for sure.
And he can do, I mean, also one of these days we're going to talk about Tiepolo by himself, right? We'll just have a thing on Tiepolo. But to me, and he would usually do this really interesting thing where he would paint something and then he'd go back over the oil edges with ink.
Yeah, it's
That's
so
part of what you're
linear.
seeing.
That's that line quality.
So he does this, and I don't know anybody else who did this at the time. He would go, and he would sometimes do it when he'd do a fresco with black oil paint over the fresco.
Where did
to
he
create
come up with
effect.
that? Did
I don't
anyone
know.
else do it?
Not anybody that I know of, but isn't it interesting the effect that it has, right? It really creates, it makes things look simultaneously like they've got an edge and like they flow. Because there's like it's almost like a wash effect in some of it.
Yeah, it's
Right.
weirdly bizarre and cool at the same time.
Yeah. And I mean, he is maybe the greatest example of an artist who had the highest skills of his time, in my opinion, but he made his career doing decorative work for architects. So an architect would create a space and they'd say, okay, we need a ceiling. The ceiling is 20 feet off the ground. People will barely be able to see your figures. And you can't control what the size or the space or where the arches are or anything in our piece. But, make yourself go crazy with it. And people will have to bend up and look at your piece from 20 or sometimes 30 or 40 feet away. So
Maybe that's why. Maybe the black line just accentuates,
makes everything pop.
Yeah. I mean, because look at that leg.
I know, dude.
That just pops.
And look at that. That foot to me, that foot, you see like the foot that's the one leading
this
out.
This one
with
right here is so great.
That could be an NC Wyeth foot.
That is so great. Man, the costume is so cool.
Isn't it the coolest?
Come up with this costume.
And you know what? It's almost all invented. He's inventing all of the costume. Some of it is Venetian from the time because there was a lot of crazy Venetian work. But if you want to understand composition when it comes to color and drapery, maybe Tiepolo is the greatest who ever did it.
I gotta be looking at him more.
Look at how he pulls that king's robe back so that you've got the brownish kind of taupish on the top and then the whitish on the bottom.
You mean here?
Folded over. Yeah. I mean, like it's just.
And look at that crown. It's like just a drawing of a crown with a splash of color in it.
I know. I think that this may be him working with a very thin brush using like an ochre or lamp black or something like that paint. I don't think this is ink. I think this is
No, it
oil.
doesn't look like ink to me.
No, but I know that he used ink in some of his frescoes, but this is all like going over with a fine brush over all the areas that he wants to draw after he's already, and it's the last thing he does from what I understand.
Yeah, look at that great head.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
What do you think one of these is worth?
Oh, his works go for hundreds of thousands.
Even something small like this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Like if I wanted an original Tiepolo, I think minimum I'd have to pay $800,000, $800,000. Yeah, they just don't. Most of his work is actually architectural because it's in palaces in mostly Venice, and then Madrid is where he dies. He does a lot of work for the royal family in Spain, and then he does work in, I think it's Dresden. I know it's in Germany. Could be Dresden, and he spends like 80% of his life in Venice doing architectural fresco work. He doesn't do many easel paintings.
I meant this one will go for more than that because this dude right here kind of looks like a banana, and bananas are hot right now.
They're so hot right now. Dude. They're so hot right now. Yeah, touche. Okay,
right, what's next?
The next work I want you to look at is it's a very dark interior scene. That's it.
Okay.
We've now jumped forward 100 years. We're no longer in Italy. We're in America, and we're looking at a work by Eastman Johnson. Eastman Johnson, he was born in Maine, but he moves to New York pretty quickly. He goes to Germany and he studies in Dusseldorf. And the people who he's working with are largely huge scale. I mean, like we're talking 20 and 30 foot long paintings, some of them, religious German painters in the 19th century. And they're also doing some genre scenes like this. He studies, after he graduates at the Royal School in Dusseldorf, he studies and assists Emanuel Leutze painting Washington crossing the Delaware. And then he comes back to the United States. He becomes a co-founder of the National Academy of Design, which is kind of the premier school in America. And he's a co-founder of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So Eastman Johnson he's an important artist from a level of the structure of art in the United States, of the schools that get formed, of the institutions that gets formed. And he's obsessed with Rembrandt. He's obsessed with Vermeer.
Oh,
And
I see Vermeer more than Rembrandt in his work.
even though he's trained in these very large scale works like Washington Crossing the Delaware, he comes back and he does all these a lot of them are interior scenes. He does, a
Yeah.
lot of kind of landscape figurative work. This piece is called it's called Christmas Time, the Blodgett Family. Christmas, that's a boring title, but the Blodgetts were an abolitionist family. They were very anti-slavery, and they helped fund the Union soldiers in the Civil War, and they were also founders of the Metropolitan Museum.
Hmm.
And so this is painted in 1864, even before the war ended. Like, this is the last year of the Civil War in America. And Eastman Johnson, the interpretation of this painting is that he's trying to show what normal family life can look like after America has been torn apart.
Oh, interesting.
And what does it look like for us to go back to a normal life after all of this? And I think we could have lots of social commentary about this painting, but I'm not bringing this into social commentary. In fact, I kind of want to contrast it with the painting that is of that's horizontal, that's this one, that's done by Winslow Homer 10 years later. And Winslow Homer studied briefly with Eastman Johnson. Put the two
Hmm.
side by side, if you would. So
Man,
the
I
Winslow
really
Homer
like this one.
painting, the Winslow Homer painting is titled "Dressing for the Carnival," and I'm just going to read what the label says of the Metropolitan Museum. It says, in this Reconstruction era painting. So the Reconstruction era painting era, for people who don't know, is after the Civil War, when the South was scorched by the Union. There was this era called Reconstruction where the North promised to reconstruct the infrastructure of the South.
Mm-hmm.
So it says, in this Reconstruction era painting, Winslow Homer evokes the dislocation and endurance of African American culture that was the legacy of slavery. The central figure represents a character from a Christmas celebration known as John Conu, once observed by the enslaved people of North Carolina and possibly Eastern Virginia.
Hmm.
So, Eastman Johnson, he comes from Europe, starts, and he's from wealth, he's working with wealthy people to create schools where, and he's also, very anti-slavery. His patrons are anti-slavery, but his subjects are very, like, waspy, like, no, the equivalent of nobility in America, right?
Mm-hmm.
And their interior life. And Winslow Homer, he's going to the South, and I'm going to read what somebody wrote about his work at the time. This is about the Winslow Homer who's painting these former slaves.
Mm-hmm.
We frankly confess that we detest his subjects. Winslow Homer has chosen the least pictorial range of scenery and civilization. He has resolutely treated them as if they were pictorial. And to reward his audacity, we should totally ignore him.
Holy piss.
Yeah, they, like, it was, and Eastman Johnson and Winslow Homer were in many ways from the same cloth, other than Winslow Homer was the first generation of Americans who were trained as fine artists and working as professional illustrators.
Hmm.
And this was not meant to be an illustration. This was meant to be a fine work of art that was presented at a contest. And it's one reason why it was so controversial, was it was mainly because he picked former slaves as his subject. But here's one of the things I want to ask you, as somebody who, you've painted a range of ethnicities over your career. And it's a very different challenge to paint people who have this dark of skin in a painting like this,
Mm-hmm.
right? What is your take on how well Winslow Homer captures that dark skin and the real and just the very different the different skills that it takes to do that.
Is it just me or the rest of you guys also get weirdly excited when you order new paint? Because I don't know about you, but when I get paint in the mail, it feels like Santa just dropped my Christmas presents off at my doorstep. With Vasari paint, my paint of choice and the podcast sponsor, it's even more exciting. And let me show you why. Because when Vasari shows up, it comes in this incredible box where each tube lays in this little compartment perfectly formed around the tube in this nice soft foam. And it's surrounded by velvet, red velvet. Now you got to ask yourself, if a paint comes so carefully protected and surrounded by red velvet, you got to wonder if this paint is worthy of royalty. It is. Vasari is. So if you haven't tried Vasari, you're seriously missing out. And the thing about Vasari, it's not only the best paint out there, it's also made by an incredible company that's been around for 30 years and knows its customer by name. Do yourself a favor, go to vasaricolors.com and order yourself some for your next painting.
I wouldn't say it takes different skills. Painting to me, I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's when I approach a face, I don't have a Caucasian face or a dark skinned face. It's just, I just look at color, value, temperature, edge, chroma, right? It's the same process no matter what the face is. So it could be dark skin on the halftones on a black person or the shadow on a white person. It's all the same, you know, or let's say reflected light on it. It's the same, you know. There might be some artists that have sort of a formula for black skin versus white skin. That's not me at all. Now, that said, I think that the one challenge of painting dark skin is that it can be very transparent because dark colors tend to be transparent.
Yeah.
And so that you can wrestle with trying to get enough coverage. And that's about it, really. But I think he handled it beautifully. It's just, this painting is by far my favorite of the two.
It is mine too. And and I mean, this isn't an artistic statement I'm about to make, but it is a philosophical thing that I think he's done here, which is, in his time, it was very common to do caricatures of former slaves or just black people in general.
Common for other artists, not
for other
him.
artists.
Okay.
And so it would be, you know, huge lips, very dark faces, bulging white eyes and teeth.
Right.
And it was, and there was almost no variation. And, you know, we use the term black, but there's such, in just this painting, the difference in warmths and cools in skin tonation that he's chosen to do here, and the lack of caricatures, in my opinion, is a really, like, it shows a lot of observational skills.
Oh yeah, this is naturalistic. There's nothing idealized or characterized. Is that a word?
Yeah.
In this painting,
Caricatured.
This is totally naturalistic to me.
You know what's one of the more interesting things to me about this on a compositional scale? Back up on it a little bit.
Okay.
Is that it's almost like the majority of the figures are on one plane in a line. And what's differentiating them is some of them are a little forward or a little back, and there's colors differentiating them, and the way that he's highlighted their hands or a shoulder or a gesture is really what makes them stick out from a boring horizontal line. And it's a brilliant compositional choice, right?
Yeah.
It's like they're lined up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 figures all in a row, but there's so much interesting variation in those 7 figures. They're just slightly overlapping and in different positions. He is such a brilliant, and it's clearly posed. I mean, the woman that's in the dead center, who's got her arm extended off to the right of the painting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe that was a gesture he captured, but the fact that he chose that and that her arm is extending over to the edge of the painting and it's the wrist is bent downwards, and then the other woman who's framing that man in the middle, how her arm is is that slight bend, and there's foreshortening of her elbow, and it's just, I mean, there, and the shadow falling over her hip. Oh my gosh, like it's just his choices as
Yeah.
Winslow Homer. He is such a careful artist, and he didn't paint in large scale usually. If you want to see his work, tons of his work all at once, go to Boston.
Well, here's what I wanted to point out. I was listening to everything you were saying, but I might have seemed distracted.
No,
But
no, no, please do. No, 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 go ahead.
so to the point we were making on the last two examples is that the reason it works so well, even though it's linear, even though it just seems like all one line, is compositionally light and dark pattern. It's not one line at all.
Yeah, you're right. Look at
Right?
that.
So
Look at
he's
that.
not thinking about figures as much as he's thinking about light and dark shapes.
Look at those women's faces, how the dark shadow, the shadows extend across their bodies in really interesting shapes from their
Yeah.
heads. So interesting.
Yeah, I mean, these kids just blend into the background except for a few dashes of light. And then you get this real strong light area through here. Yeah. And then this real strong light area through here.
I mean,
Hmm.
he really is, in a way, going, the fact that he would go 10 years after the Civil War to the South and paint with what I think is enormous dignity these figures who are not, I mean, this is a Northern critic who's saying to him, we detest his subjects, but he's using his skills that are given to him by people who have been trained to paint fine and gentle subjects, in quotations,
Mm-hmm.
to be a documenter of the humblest people, the salt of the earth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a now largely lost Christmas tradition of this figure who's a kind of Father Christmas figure in the foreground that comes from that North Carolina and Eastern Virginia, what they call Jonkonu, African Christian celebration. He's the Father Christmas figure.
You know what else is amazing about this painting? I don't care about these people here. In the painting in the parlor with this family, this fairly wealthy looking family.
Yeah.
At no point did I think to myself, ooh, I'd love to meet these people. But I am dying to know these
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
Homer painting. Like, what were they like? What were their lives like? Who were they?
Well,
And
and
that's
that's
I
interesting.
think that
That's
he
interesting.
did it. It's because of how he painted it. Another observation, which is probably ridiculous, but I can't help but to notice it and point it out, is that in the painting on the right, remind me the artist's name. You know my memory.
Eastman Johnson.
Eastman Johnson on the right. He paints incredibly thin
Yeah.
and incredibly thin. And look at
Yeah.
this. I mean,
Yeah.
even the lights are just scumbled on, and the darks are just a wash. I mean, the canvas is coming through everywhere. And right
And
here,
by the
this-
way, he's got amazing control, doesn't he? He's amazing.
yeah, he does, but it's so thin, it's easy to control. That's my point.
Interesting.
Like, so, but the only place he gets impasto is one highlight right here on the entire painting. I'm not making fun of him. I'm laughing.
no, no, no,
I
no.
probably shouldn't
I
be.
know what you're saying.
But the Homer painting,
Yeah, with the big dollops that are on almost everybody.
chunky, bold paint. Where is that again? Chunky, bold paint. So here's the connection I'm going to make, and I don't know if it's valid, but this artist was socially as bold as he was artistically.
Yeah.
Like, it takes guts to paint like this.
Yeah.
The other guy's timid, cautious, just trying to have complete control, not wanting to put too much paint, might lose control.
Mm.
Whereas he's like, and that's what happens when you put too much paint down. It's harder to balance it. It's like juggling 20 balls instead of
Interesting.
3,
That's interesting. It's a really
Whereas Homer's just piling it on. And then at the same time, he's painting something that he knows might bite him in the butt.
Yeah, and look at like the difference between the fence on the far right and how little detail there is and how much there is on the left. And he's making all kinds of choices like that. The impasto's thicker in some places and others, but I mean, but there are
Whoops.
huge dollops,
Oh, it's
huge dollops of
chunky.
paint.
It's
And
really chunky. I mean, it's bold.
I mean,
I wonder if there's a connection in his personality. If we could do a personality test of this guy, if the
Yeah.
boldness in his application of paint somehow is connected to the boldness of his character.
yeah.
It'd be an interesting.
There's some great biographies of Winslow Homer that I haven't. I
Really?
read one years ago, but I cannot remember many of the details. He really was a character, and he was greatly admired as kind of a renegade, mostly for his approach, but mostly his subject matter. He was kind of an adventurer. He'd go out with the Maine lobster fishermen, and he'd go out on the high seas and try and capture the waves while a storm was going on. And he'd depict shark attacks. I mean, he was a really interesting guy. He was an interesting
Hmm.
guy. I know it's a really thin excuse that I picked this as a Christmas image because I mean it is Christmas, right?
Yeah.
But I just I couldn't help that here are two Christmas images of two different Americas simultaneously existing after the Civil War, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's the North, people in their European clothing painted by a European trained artist, and then on the left, former slaves in rags holding American flags while they're celebrating Christmas, and by an artist who's being ridiculed for painting that, who's being ridiculed for applying his fine skills to what's considered an unworthy subject, but he doesn't think it's unworthy.
Hmm. That's
It's
awesome. That was a great choice.
awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the Saturday Evening Post cover of Santa Claus on a ladder.
Santa
We gotta
Claus on a ladder.
We gotta go like there you are. Okay.
That's hilarious.
So that's
a big leap from where we were.
This is Leyendecker. Now, Leyendecker was born in Chicago, worked mostly in Chicago. He joined as a young boy an advertising company, and then took night classes at the Art Institute of Chicago from John Vanderpoel. Vanderpoel, his manuals are still used today for anatomy training. And you and I would know Vanderpoel here locally because Vanderpoel trained Minerva Teichert. He trained a lot of artists admired him. He was one of the greatest figurative sketchers in the history of art, and his manuals are reproduced by Dover Publishing and used a lot by artists. Even if you don't recognize the name, if you looked up John Vanderpoel, you'd recognize who he was. So he studies with Vanderpoel, Leyendecker does. And then Leyendecker goes to the Académie Julienne in France and studies for a couple of years with Jules Lefebvre, Bouguereau, a lot of the other artists that we know. And he continues he paints in oil. And if you can see I wanted to give you the sketch for this, which
right
you'll
here.
find. So, yeah, you can this is how he sketched things out. And this is him in oil working. And
I don't understand what he's doing.
He said that what he would do when he was asked about his approach is he would come up with multiple sketches of the same figure, and then he would eventually land on what he liked. He said he wasn't very detailed in how he described it, but he really invents, for the most part, the Christmas images that we're used to, because he becomes the model for Rockwell, and Rockwell basically wholeheartedly, the first part of Rockwell's career is stealing from Leyendecker. And I'm not trying to take away from the genius of Norman Rockwell, but I am trying to show that here's a guy who is considered an illustrator, but he was trained classically by figurative artists, who's one of the greatest figurative artists of his time, Vanderpoel, Bouguereau, Lefebvre, and in France. I mean, he was trained by salon French Beaux-Arts academic artists. And this is, you see his study and then the final result as it's printed. And he's considered an illustrator, not a fine artist, even to this day. And people consider that what he did is largely being pulp and commercial and advertising work. I have one more example of his work.
I'd hang
that
it
I
on my
gave.
wall.
There was a study that is a woman. Um, there's the oil study that's framed, and then there's the magazine cover that's not that
Not
one.
that.
So that's the final magazine cover. And then next to it is a partial version of it, which is far to the left, which she's in
Nope.
black.
She's in
It's far to
black?
the,
Oh,
yeah,
over
it's, he
here, over
changed,
here.
yeah, he dramatically changed the palette
What?
for the final work.
That is dramatic.
Yeah. Yeah.
What in the heck?
Yeah.
Was it possible that the complete narrative of the job got changed somehow?
It's possible. Yeah. I mean, we don't
How do you
have a
go
lot.
from this to this?
It's hard for me to find studies of Leyendecker that are in oil, but the oil is the left and the painting is the right.
Wait. You said the same thing twice. Oil and painting?
The oil is on the right. The painting is, sorry, the oil is on the right and the finished magazine is on the left.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. That's wild.
Yeah.
Man, I'd love to get in their head and figure out what in the world happened there.
But it gives you an idea of he's got a limit. I think somebody once told me this, that once you're working with CMYK printing processes that were available to him in the 1890s to the 1920s and 30s, you can do blacks and reds, but you can't really do blues very well. And you can't do yellows that strongly. I mean, he's really limited. He can't do purple. He's got this very limited range. So when you do a black painting and you change it to a red, you can do black and red almost interchangeably in the printing process. But you can't do but he's limited in his palette with what he can work with, not as an oil painter, but as the printing process that happens at the end of it.
These studies are gold.
Aren't they gold?
Yeah, the study's so much more interesting than the finished piece to me. Part of it is because I can really see the paint, and you're right, a lot is lost in the print.
Leyendecker is a very it's very fashionable to talk about him in terms of sexuality these days because he was gay. And I'm not saying that wasn't interesting or important to his biography, but art historians almost never talk about his process. They almost just talk about him from what was it like to be a successful artist and be gay in the at the turn of the century and during the World War I and then the economic collapse that happened with the Great Depression, which are interesting questions. But to me, the conversation I would love to have more and more people talk about is how did he do things? And one museum that's doing some work on this is the HEIN Museum, which is in Stockton, California. They have more Leyendeckers than anywhere else in the world. And these came from the Leyendecker, the Facebook page of the HEIN Museum. That's where I got this study. And I wish the HEIN Museum, if you're listening, HEIN director, please put more and more studies up online, because it's really fascinating to see how a classically trained academic artist is painting oils that he knows are going to be turned into prints in a lithographic age, and him knowing how he's got to limit his palette and how he's got to control line and value. He's just, and it's all very, he's not, let's be frank. I mean, this art works for mass consumption. He's not doing a high-end nativity scene. He was very capable of doing remarkable nativity and deep scenes. We've seen a lot of his work. I mean, look at all the values in that hand of the man, the left hand of that man. And look at the extreme position he's picked for that hand.
I know, that's what I was noticing. I need to learn from artists like this, because it's kind of like Broadway. I've noticed that a lot of the great paintings treat painting like Broadway treats acting relative to film, where they kind of overact. Because it's on the stage and the audience is a little further away. So you kind of have to, I don't know anything about acting, but this is what I understand. You have to kind of overact and yell your part and just have big, strong gestures. But in painting, it also lacks a lot of the benefits that film do. We don't have motion. It's a still image. We don't have sound. We don't have music and so on and so forth. So I find that a lot of great narrative painters overact with their figures. They push things to almost unnatural positions in order to express movement in a way that a still image normally wouldn't be able to, particularly if it were more naturalistic. Because no one holds their hand like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love, we haven't said what the narrative here is. There's a woman who's doing her shopping list for Christmas, and damn it, that boy is I'm doing this for you. I'm buying these presents. Right? You're gonna come along with me while I do it. And she's going down the list, which is in a notebook in her hand. And the guy behind her is either the husband who's holding the presents precariously in the final version, or he's like a porter or something like that, who's a clerk who's holding the presents that she's just bought. And it's like, and I prefer the dark version rather to the red version, but I can see why for the final print, that's the magazine on the stand, why they chose the red.
Well, yeah, obviously.
I mean, but it's way better with all those dark tones, isn't it? It's way better.
Well, and it's hard to tell for sure for me personally, if I'm attracted to the paint as much. And I just love sketches as a painter. I just love sketches because they get in the head of the artist more. So I'm attracted to that too. But there's some weird stuff happening here, but it's not a weakness of the artist. But I just got to point something out that I find kind of interesting.
Please do, yeah.
Is like just the way that arm passes through the hand. It's like behind
it doesn't
her
quite
hand.
Work, does it?
Yeah. But it makes sense because he's figuring this stuff out. He might have drawn her and then he adds the figure and just trying to, maybe if I put the hand through here. It's all a process. Yeah. But it's interesting to watch that process through little funky things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love how he exaggerates not just the hands, but the faces, and he really simplifies things to do almost caricatures of faces, right? It's it's that
same thing I was telling you, like with the hand. It's like you almost have to make them overact in order to tell the story. Otherwise, it's boring. And look at that little head, that giant woman with that tiny head.
I know, right?
It just makes her
which
feel.
Which is such a deliberate choice. I mean,
obviously.
Once again, this is not about accuracy, which is one of the great things about Leyendecker, is he knows what to emphasize and what to caricaturize.
Yeah, this woman is rich, sophisticated, and well-fed. That's probably what he's saying.
So in the last one I'm going to show you is I have to end on a Sorolla.
Okay. Right here? No? Where's Sorolla?
That's a Sorolla. So this is a grisaille in oil that he did of the painting is titled Noche Buena, which means it's Christmas Eve in Spain. And it's when they get together and they play songs and do a nativity. And that's what's on the far right, is there's on a big stuffy chair an impromptu scene of the nativity. And if you zero in, I mean, this painting is only like,
wait, where?
Like,
right here,
right there.
Right here.
Go in. It's a whole nativity set.
Oh yeah.
With a palm tree and a little star hanging up. And one of the girls was holding so that's the palm tree. And it's only about 6 inches by 8 inches.
What's the medium? Is it gouache?
It's gouache. Yeah, it's gouache. He's working in gouache. And he did it this way because it was being reprinted for friends as a Christmas card. So he did it entirely in black and white. I mean, I know there's a little bit.
Do you think
of
the paper was white when he did it originally?
Well, he did this is oil on canvas, or not oil, gouache on canvas, but he gave it to a printer who photographed it and then reproduced it as a Christmas card.
Oh, okay. Because I was just asking, I was just wondering if he intended to have the paper underneath be so warm, or if it just aged over time.
No, no, that's canvas that he did like
A
a
wash.
sienna wash underneath,
Okay.
like a Spanish brown wash underneath the whole thing. And then it was photographed, like I said,
Hmm.
and reproduced as a small Christmas card that would have been roughly the size of the painting, which was, like I said, 6 by 8 or a little smaller. Um, but what I wanted to show you, why I wanted to end on this is, Sorolla is doing these really large scale multi-figural works with lots of color, a lot and he's not known for doing a lot of black and white drawing work, but he was trained in it as a young man. And I, you just, what a, if somebody had told you as an artist, who was maybe a student or a friend, my kids made this nativity set. It's really complicated, and they put it on the back of a chair, and then they were dancing around it and doing a tambourine. And I want to do a 6 by 8 size in black and white rough, just basically grisaille. And I want to capture that nativity set. And I want to capture them dancing, and I want to capture them in the living room, and I want to capture what's on the mantelpiece, and I want it to be very naturalistic. And it's such an impossible amount of information that he successfully, I mean, it's not meant to be a finished contest work, but it's meant to still convey all that information. And he does it. He
Well,
does
yeah,
it in a six
Sorolla's
by eight.
superhuman.
I mean, and his wife is right behind the tambourine that the kids are playing. His boy's sitting on the ground playing by a fire on a drum set. And there's not a lot of attempt to, he's cut off the chair that's on the far left. And I think that really interesting choice to include the nativity set. If I were taking a photograph of my family, I wouldn't want this complicated of a scene. I would want
Yeah,
them all like
interesting. But he
my
doesn't look
Chris.
too busy to me.
It doesn't look too busy. I mean, it's amazing that he can do this, isn't it? It's just
No, it
unbelievable.
doesn't.
And it's a
Maybe
Christmas card.
so his family more than likely made this nativity set.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Oh,
they
I'm
and
sure he's just really proud of it. Just the whole and watching his family.
yeah, he's got this young
It's a
family.
sentimental painting, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. That's
And
cool.
look at how he's highlighted the fireplace over
And
the boy.
yeah,
And like
and the little things on top.
and the
All it
little
is a
things
few
on top.
highlights. There's nothing
Yeah.
there.
And look at his wife's smile and face, which is partially covered, and
I know
the
that's gold.
the star that's above the set, and then all the architectural setting of the I mean, zero in on the nativity for a minute. I just couldn't believe how much information is in this.
Yeah, there's like a whole city, all
It's
Jerusalem
all
back there.
Jerusalem right there. And it's just, to me, I think about how we I know it's kind of an axe that I grind on a regular basis, but we talk about modernism saying, um for a long time, now that there's photographs, we don't need to paint the way that we used to. It's all about ideas now. The choices that he's making here have nothing to do with photography and accuracy on
Mm-hmm.
on so many levels. It's and the skills that it took to choose what information he's telling us and how he draws our eye around it and what information he leaves out and how he knows that we're going to fill in information with our brains. And that's a whole nativity set that we have so little information on it, but we know it's Jerusalem because we know what a dome on the rock looks like, right? We've seen so
Mm-hmm.
many Jerusalem sets in our brain that we create Jerusalem when we look at that. He didn't need to fill it in that much. It's just, it blows my mind when I see an artwork like this that I don't know how long it took him to do this. I would imagine it took him a couple days. he doesn't spend a lot of time on work. He goes fast, you know?
Oh, I bet it's even less than that.
Yeah.
Based on what he's, I mean, things we've talked about even on the podcast, the way he worked outside and in plein air, how fast he was.
And then he goes to his guy. He may have even photographed it himself because he worked with his father-in-law was one of the country's greatest photographers at the time.
Oh, did he do this from a photo then?
No, well, he may have done it from a photo. I don't know if that exists, but he had the photographer. He at least had a photograph of it taken so that it could be reproduced en masse.
Oh, right, yeah.
For his friends as a Christmas card, and so, you know, I look at these. Here we've gone from the late 1200s to 600 plus years later. A lot of the things that we discussed today were about composition and value and how artists make the choices they do. And there's so much. I love that we have a theme that we can choose of Christmas that allows us to pick such different artists from one another and talk about one thing. And maybe not talk about Christmas, but just talk about how these artists in making Christmas works of art really showcased all their skill sets and whatever was at the time the choices that made them so interesting at the time they were working. It just
and it's cool that thing ties them all together.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
I feel so grateful that we live at a time when we can see these works of art, right? And you and I can get together and talk about them rather than we don't have to go to Italy to see them. We don't have to go to New York to see them. We don't have to go to Spain or England. We can, we shouldn't, every time you can get in front of real art, do what you can, right? But the fact that you're listening to this podcast and that we're all sharing this and talking about these works of art, that's the miracle of the time we live in.
Oh yeah, it's such a blessing. Seriously. Yeah, we're spoiled rotten.
We are spoiled rotten. I'm grateful you'd asked me to come do this, Jeff. I love this. This is my favorite thing to do.
Yeah, can I tell people what you've agreed to do?
Yeah.
Micah, you will be coming on every single month. Yeah. At least for the next year. We're going to try that out and see if your schedule can handle it.
I would love to.
Because people freaking love you, man. So that's such a gift to the podcast. It's great to have you on again.
I love doing it. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me, buddy. Merry Christmas.
You too, man.
Thanks for tuning in to the Undraped Artist Podcast. If you enjoyed it, subscribe. And if you could, leave a comment or review. That really helps the channel. Please share the show with your friends, and if you're feeling generous, consider a monthly donation at theundrapedartist.com. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next week.